Okay, everybody, I show straight up at 7 o'clock, and I believe in starting promptly and ending promptly if we can. So as I mentioned, I'm filling in for Kelly, who wasn't feeling well, but the biggest part of our meeting, the reason I expect most people are interested tonight, will be the main program on restorative justice that Barbara Cray will moderate, and she'll introduce the speakers. I believe everybody participating in that discussion is at the firehouse at the moment. But and Barbara, if you can hear me, I would like to turn the next hour over to you.
Okay, thank you all for being here. This is a great crowd and a lot of people on Zoom. Thank you all for being interested in the concept of restorative justice. I am very happy to have special guests, very special guests today. Our DA Natasha Irving, our Sheriff Todd Bracket, and Drew Himmelstein from the Restorative Justice Program. And I will introduce each of them as it's their turn to talk. Our intention, I'm going to give an introduction, then each party will talk maybe for about 10 minutes about their restorative justice thoughts and experiences and ideas. And then we will turn it over to questions. So feel free to ask questions here. And if you have a question on Zoom, please put it in the chat box and we will try to monitor that as best we can. Okay, so I want to give you a little bit of a background of what restorative justice is, because it can be very broad or it can be very narrow. Basically, restorative justice examines the harmful impact of a crime, excuse me, I'll get it closer, and then determines what can be done to repair the harm while holding the person who caused it accountable for their actions. Restorative justice can actually be used in a much broader sense. In other words, we get trained in restorative principles, and that could be used, you know, in a homeowner's dispute or a, you know, an employment issue, or, you know, it's a kind of resolution technique. And it can be broader, but what we're going to talk about today is restorative justice in the criminal context, because that is where it's really started and it's most impactful at this point. And if we can get it really going well and working well in that context, then it can be more adequately expanded outward. And so I also want to bring out that, well, I thought of something and it went away. I want to let that go for right now. But anyway, let me tell you a little bit about the basic principles of restorative justice as it relates to crime. As you know, our typical issue, our situation maybe 100 years ago is that you send the criminal to jail for them to be restored. And that didn't really happen. Now we largely send people to jail to be punished, but we're making more and more endeavors toward a more cooperative and restorative, I guess I'm going to use that word again, process. But restorative justice in the criminal side of this has several different principles. And I'm sorry, I'm wondering if you're hearing me adequately. So let me know if you don't, because I hear my P's sometimes and sometimes I don't. So anyway, there's several principles to restorative justice. The first is that crime is an offense. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. I'm sorry, I should always remember this because this is our status now, but restorative justice comes from indigenous populations largely in New Zealand and in the United States, who have used these principles far more effectively than many people, and that we are now borrowing from and appreciating. Okay, so principles. Crime is an offense against human relationships. Second, victims and the community are central to the justice process. The third is the first priority of the justice process is to assist the victim. The second priority is to restore the community to the best degree possible. Next, the offender has personal responsibility to victims and to the community for crimes committed. Next, stakeholders share responsibilities for restorative justice through partnerships and action. And lastly, the offender will develop improved competency and understanding as a result of the restorative justice experience. So you can see that that's sort of a new paradigm for dealing with criminal activity and how to address harm. And so I want to talk to you a little bit just about my experience with restorative justice so you can understand how I came from it. And I think it gives you a little bit of an illustration of a sort of a regular person handling it. And that is that when I moved to Maine, I had to wait for the state bar to admit me as an attorney, which took a little time, but not a lot. And I was looking for something to do. And in the May forecaster of 2018, I saw a notice to be trained for restorative justice as a facilitator. And I thought, what's restorative justice? They don't really have that in California, believe it or not. And it turned out that Maine has a fairly vibrant program relative to restorative justice, although there's different organizations that offer this. And I got at that time trained by Restorative Justice of Mid-Coast Maine, which has now become Restorative Justice Maine. And I just really appreciated being able to add this dimension to myself as a lawyer and as a mediator, now a facilitator for restorative justice. And my very first case was transformative, in my opinion. I just really realized how it worked. It was a young man who had made a threat of bringing a gun to school, which is sort of a big deal. But he actually didn't have access to a gun and he thought he was being cool, but one of his friends reported it and then it had to go to the school and it became a serious incident. And he didn't really understand why it wasn't a joke. And we started the restorative process with him, met with him, his parents, the harm parties, which are basically the school and the students, and then had a circle, which is what we have. Once we meet with everyone, we have a circle, a community circle, where we talk about these issues. And so the young man was there, his parents were there, the community members were there, and school representatives were there. And when the vice president of the school talked about what it really meant for this to happen and all the procedures they had to go through to secure the school and the reaction that the students had and the fear they had, and when a community member addressed the fear they had, the kid finally got it and broke down in tears. And you don't want people to cry per se, but you want to know that you had an impact. And so all of a sudden, once this occurred, he was able to take accountability for what he did and be able to come up with a repair agreement and work with a mentor and be able to complete that repair agreement and come to a closing circle, being very aware of the harm that he caused and he didn't want to harm it again. And, you know, that was just, to me, almost miraculous that that system works so well. So I became an immediate convert, and I've been now with the Restorative Justice Project in Maine for 5 years. And in fact, even had a circle today of an adult. It's usually been juveniles, but it was an adult. And so I very much appreciate this. And we will also be talking about how you can get involved in this process as a volunteer as we go along. But I just wanted to give you that basic background to say why I think this is a great process and why it works. Okay, so now, as I said, we're focusing on the criminal aspect here. And so let me just get my little screen here for just a moment. So first, we're going to start with Natasha Irving, our DA for Lincoln County, as well as 3 others. Oops, I just lost my pick. And let me give a brief introduction. I'll turn it over to her. Natasha is the first woman and the first Democrat to hold the office of District Attorney in Prosecutorial District 6, which is our district. She was born and raised in Waldoboro, studied philosophy and religious studies at Loyola University, New Orleans, and served a year in AmeriCorps before earning her JD degree at the University of Maine School of Law. She's the proud daughter of 2 stepdaughters and 2 daughters, ranging in age from 2 to 18. And that was exampled by the fact that she took the bar exam 8 months pregnant and was the first person to give birth as a sitting district attorney. In the state of Maine. Oh yeah, who knows? Yeah, in the state of Maine. Yeah, in the state of Maine. She's dedicated her work to transforming the criminal justice system, moving towards centering our community response to harm on victims' needs and healing, harm prevention, and fostering of resilient communities and institutions, and accountability, healing, and cycle breaking for offenders. This in turn means transitioning away from the bureaucracy of punishment, paternalism towards victims, and the dehumanization of those who commit harm. That sounds pretty good to me. So now we're going to let Natasha speak. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, I so far I was able to unmute the microphone, so check. I wrote that bio, and it was I'm really I have a difficult time with stuff like that. But it was the week that my stepdaughter Lily was graduating from high school, and it was I have a 2-year-old in the house, and my stepdaughter, who I'd been in her life since she was 4, was graduating. It was a wonderful time. So I came to be a believer in restorative justice, a big believer in restorative justice when I was a defense attorney. Now, and I did defense. I actually had a general practice, but I did quite a bit of defense. Before that, I was familiar with restorative justice. I was a philosophy major. I was interested in religious studies. I had done a lot of volunteer work with the Jesuit priests at Loyola University in New Orleans, and they were the real social justice kind of left-winger liberation theology. Gosh, I hope no Republicans are watching this. They'll be fainting, right? So those are like all the key words, right? So I was familiar with it, but I hadn't really been involved in it, right? So when I was a defense attorney, there was a pilot project with Restorative Justice of Midcoast Maine for adult offenders, adult shoplifting offenders, right? And I had this client named Brian, and he had a significant criminal history. Started when he was 13, broke into a business with some other kids and stole some cigarettes, cartons of cigarettes. That was most of his types of crimes that he committed. I had him as a client. He was about 30. Most of his crimes were serious in nature. I mean, breaking into a business is, we frown upon that. Stealing, we frown upon that, but he wasn't a violent criminal. And he had ended up doing years in prison, years. And his last bid at the Maine State Prison, he told me that he would be put in solitary because he couldn't conform his behavior, right? And it was so torturous that he would cut himself and bleed all over the place so he could have some human contact. And he was looking at going back to prison. The offer that I had from the state was 2 years for stealing some items from a local grocery store. He was very high when it happened, so he is actually blacked out. He would take an entire bottle of Xanax at a time because he had some serious mental health and substance use issues. So he didn't remember doing it, but he's that sounds like something maybe I would have done, right? We watched the video together, and he said, "Yep, that's me." And I said, "Okay, well, we're good. I am just going to beg, and I can wear people down. I have been known to be able to wear people down when I was a defense attorney. That's most of what you do is you just beg. You beg for the mercy of the prosecutor. And I couldn't get where I needed to get because it was like, 2 years. I think I got the prosecutor down to about 1.5 years. And for him, that was the idea of having to go through that again. He would have rather died, but he had a little baby and he had children that he loved, and he was a good dad. I mean, he had his issues, right? But he was a good, kind man. He was a fisherman. He provided for his family. He was trying to do the right thing. So we have a sentencing argument because we don't have any leg to stand on. So part of the benefit you can get from a plea deal is that you've admitted guilt, right? By saying, I plead guilty. Or actually the judge says, how do you plead? And you say guilty. So that's the accountability portion of the system that we have right now. If you plead guilty, you say guilty, right? And then your lawyer gets up there and says, these are the mitigating factors. This is why this person should not go to prison, for stealing, less than $100 worth of items that he can pay restitution for. And there was this restorative justice pilot project, and this is what I've left out. I begged and begged and begged the prosecutor to let me send this guy, to refer this guy to this pilot project. And the answer was no. The answer was just no. Just, we won't do that. Nope. The victim doesn't want it. The business didn't want it. And of course, you can't cram things down the victim's throat, but there's other ways to do it, right? In a situation like this. So we do the sentencing argument. The judge gives him 2 years. And that was it. That's when I decided I have to do something. And it was right around that time that Jeff Rushlaw was appointed to be a judge. So he had been our district attorney for 19 years. He is a brilliant man. I will tell you, he is an exceptionally brilliant man. He's retired as a judge now, but I saw my opportunity to at least try, right? And what I didn't know is that Larry Krasner was out in Philadelphia, and he's like, famous like for trying to be, in a much bigger sense, right? But but having the same idea. Well, why not just change the system from within? And so that's why that's when I first became very familiar with restorative justice. And it was really is a, like, this sounds great. This is the kind of, right, this is better for our communities. And it's going to be better for my client. And then the more I learned about it over, that time, the more I doubled down that this is really the way that people can be held accountable, and have real accountability. This is how we actually address harm to victims, because saying guilty and then having a judge tell you how long you're going to spend in a cell or how much money you're going to pay in a fine, that's not accountability. Victims, most of the time, no matter what there is for sentence, whether it's a fine or 40 years in prison, most victims are not feeling any healing process or repair through that. There's restitution payments, right? But you don't have that come to Jesus moment where you say, I did this to you, and this is why I did it. And that's, people want to know why. The other thing victims often want to know, and victims are all different, they're all individuals just like all of us, but they want to know why it happened, and they want it to not happen to somebody else. And this is something that I've learned over the years, and maybe you all know this, but maybe you don't hear prosecutors say this a lot. People are good. People are good. People do bad things. I have met very few people, and I go to the Maine State Prison twice a month, and I work with folks in our Restorative Justice Steering Committee who've been convicted of homicide and other very, very serious offenses. And those people are good people that committed terrible crimes and will pay for it for the rest of their lives, not just because they're sitting in a cell, but because facing what you've done is much harder than any of the other stuff. When I was 18, I read Crime and Punishment, and it changed my life. And everybody should read it, right? Because it's the internal punishment. We're all human beings. We were all evolved to be good to each other, and we all feel it when we're not. So a restorative justice process, right? It's not bureaucratic. It's human beings sitting down together. It's a victim saying, this is how I was harmed. It's an offender saying, this is why I did it. It's people saying, this is how we're going to support you. It's a victim saying, this is what I need to be better. It's an offender saying, this is what I need to be better. And I'm going to tell you one more secret, is that most of the folks that we're dealing with in the criminal justice system, especially the more serious offenses, especially the repeat offenders, they're all victims too. And I don't mean that they're victims of the criminal justice system. I mean, they're survivors of violent crime. I mean, the biggest common denominator of the men at Maine State Prison is that they are survivors of violent crime, of sexual trauma, and of trauma. And if we don't start treating violence like the public health threat that it is, we are going to continue on this path. So I am, for very, very many reasons, I believe that to have real accountability, real change in offenders, and real healing for victims and communities and resilient communities, we need to move to a model that is not faceless, not bureaucratic, but that takes individual needs and safety of communities and victims and offenders into account when we really look at what justice is. So that's my 30,000-foot view. So it probably wasn't maybe the answer we were all looking for, but that's my intro. Who is next?
Thank you very much. That was really very helpful. Okay, well, next we have Sheriff Bracket. He began his career in 1985 at the age of 19, as almost 18, as a corrections officer for the Kennebec County Sheriff's Office. In 1986, he was promoted to patrol deputy, where he served until moving to the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office in 1988. He served in the patrol division as a K-9 handler and corporal until 1998, when he was hired as chief of police for the town of Damascotta. And he was elected sheriff of Lincoln County in 2002 and was reelected for his 6th term as sheriff in 2022. So please, Sheriff Bracket, your turn.
Well, thank you. It's always difficult for a police officer to speak after an attorney. Natasha is eloquent as always, and I appreciate her insight in restorative justice. Yeah, I look at the restorative justice process from a little different angle, right? We're on the front lines where the crime is being reported, the harm is being reported to us, and as you know, and you know, restorative justice has really picked up some steam here in the last 6 years, maybe 7 years. But it's not a new concept. It's not new. It's not new to Lincoln County in the sense that, gee whiz, since I was born in 18, and started my career in 18, you know, almost a little over 20 years ago, when I was still a deputy sheriff here working for then Sheriff Bill Carter, we had restorative justice came to Maine. We had some training. A handful of us, myself, as a law enforcement officer, Mary Trescott. Some of you may know Mary, of course, right? Is one of our county commissioners, who was also working at the sheriff's office at the time. Jay Pinkerton, who used to be the assistant head of school at Lincoln Academy, and oh gee whiz, I just drew a blank. Cindy, not Cindy. Cindy, was it? Oh, gee whiz. She was the principal at Great Salt Bay School at the time. I'm going to remember her name in just a minute. I was just talking about her. Thank you, Cindy Petty. And we all went to all went to the training. It was an interesting concept, focused mostly on juveniles at the time. In fact, solely on juvenile crime. And it was, and I think that one of the things that, and like Barbara, my first restorative circle was enlightening. It was an assault case. It was a simple assault. In other words, it was a misdemeanor assault. You know, not a felony assault, if you will. So there was no serious bodily harm. It was a offensive physical contact. I don't remember the details of it at the time. And the victim was there. And to have everybody in a circle looking face to face, and go through the process, and to see the victim's ability to be able to share their feelings and the impact that had on the young man that was involved in this particular assault at the time, was really a new experience for me. I was used to going to district court, and you go through the traditional process, or superior court, and you have a trial months down the road. And that's another thing that really intrigues me the most about restorative justice is it's really designed to be timely, as close to the event. So if we have a crime that qualifies, and that's another thing that's a challenge for us, and Natasha can probably speak more to this later on, but not to put pressure on her. But not all crimes qualify currently, right, to go to be referred to restorative justice. So that's one of the obstacles, or one of the challenges that we have in the justice system. It's change, it's new, to our traditional justice system here in Maine, and but it's really, I think, really beginning to get a good footing and move forward. But if we have somebody who commits a crime today, adult or youth under the age of 18, and we can put together a restorative justice circle within a week or 2 weeks, and that's a tall order even now, because there's a lot of moving parts to it. And Drew may talk more about the actual aspects of it. That is so much faster than our current justice system. It's so much fresher in everybody's mind, not just the victim, but the perpetrator, the suspect, or the youth or the adult that's involved in the case. And I think historically it's so much more effective. I mean, we think of ourselves as parents, and you think of the way that we brought up our own children, or the things that we learned from our community. And I can remember when I was a youngster, my grandmother told me, you can't shit an old kitchen cook stove. in the kitchen and had an oven in it and some burners on top, and she'd feed logs into the top of the stove, and she can't touch the stove. The stove is hot. You know what I mean? Well, she didn't wait until after I touched the stove and then a week later tell me, geez, it was hot. Well, that's kind of the way our justice system traditionally works, right? So, it was to be effective for me, the timeliness of it, I think, is a really crucial component of it, because our justice system can be very slow, very, very slow for lots of reasons. And so it's been really beneficial. I'm really excited about the opportunities that the restorative justice has for adults. I've never experienced an adult case in restorative justice personally. We have in our agency, but I haven't myself. And I'm excited about it because I think that it's a step in the right direction. I think that we can move some of these cases through. We can reduce the number of folks that end up in our county jail. And there's just an endless amount of benefit, that some of which you've already heard. So that's really kind of where I'm coming from. Be glad to answer any questions as we move forward.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now that you've heard from it on the ground and in the courts, now we're going to talk about the Restorative Justice Project that exists here for Midcoast, Maine, with Drew Himmelstein. And let me just, I just note for you that Drew has some slides. So if you want to get those ready, that would be great. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about Drew. She became interested in restorative justice after learning about the impact of trauma-informed practices on social emotional learning through her previous work as an education writer. She spent the past 18 months learning from and listening to community members in Lincoln and Knox counties about their strengths and needs, teaching about restorative practices, and facilitating a community-led process to create community justice hubs as a community justice manager for the Restorative Justice Project of Maine. She considers storytelling and community empowerment to be cornerstones of her work. She has written and produced audio journalism for a wide variety of outlets. She lives in Rockland with her husband and 2 sons who are growing up as 4th-generation Rockland residents. Drew.
Thank you. Okay, well, yes, I did, I did bring the slides, but I am actually relying on them to remember what I was going to say. So I'm glad that I did. So yes, welcome. So I'm from Restorative Justice Project Maine. We were a nonprofit that was founded in 2005, and we exist in the 4 Mid-Coast counties that also encompass the prosecutorial district. So Waldo, Knox, Lincoln, and Saginaw County. And our harm repair program works closely with the district attorney's office and law enforcement, and we accept referrals of cases that we process through a restorative process. And in most cases, the person who is referred to us gets a better outcome for resolving their case that way. So if everything goes according to plan with our restorative process, then their charges might be dismissed. Sometimes their charges are reduced. It's case to case. We have been heavy on the juvenile side, but we, as mentioned, we also take adult referrals as well. Oh, and yes, so that's kind of what I just said. Will you go to the next slide? Okay, and so yeah, so one of the cornerstones of the idea of restorative justice is that it's community based, and our belief is that to really create safe communities, it's based on community connections and community relationships. And so the idea of restorative justice is about really repairing relationships after harm has happened. And what I'll often say is, it's not the expectation that people are going to walk out of a restorative circle or restorative conference and be best friends. But I do think it's a recognition, especially in like our small communities that we live in here, that we're all part of the same community. And you probably will run into that person, at the gas station, or, like that life goes on. And so, and so repairing those relationships relationships is a recognition of the communities that we live in. And can you, okay. Oh yeah, and so with the restorative process, we're kind of approaching it a little different than the criminal process. So when a criminal matter is brought up, we're asking, well, what law was broken and who should be punished, like, and you know, what are the penalties that are going to be applied? And with the restorative process, we're really going to the people who are most directly affected. So we're saying, how have you been affected? What has been hurt? How can that be repaired? And so the thinking is that the people closest to the harm are the ones who are best able to articulate how to repair it and how to solve it. Yeah, go ahead. Oh yeah, and this is our sort of our philosophy. Long term, maybe a generation from now, that all crimes in Maine are met with a restorative response. Schools, we actually do a lot of work with schools, and in fact, schools are where in my experience, where people know about restorative processes the most, because it's really it's become pretty prevalent among educators and teachers. And we work with school districts to train groups of teachers and administrators on restorative practices, with the aim of having them use restorative practices themselves within their schools. And it's really interesting because we at the Restorative Justice Project, we will get cases referred to us through the courts that are incidents that have happened in school. And that's because for whatever reason, someone has filed charges. Sometimes it's because a parent or someone involved really wants charges to be filed. But then it ends up coming to us anyway. And so one of our visions is that, you know, that we can give more and more schools can have the capacity to use those restorative processes within their schools, and not having to go through the criminal side of things. And can you go on? Okay, and yes, referral sources. So of course we have the courts and the district attorneys, law enforcement, our JCCOs, juvenile community corrections officers. We're trying to strengthen our relationships with defense attorneys, as Natasha spoke to really eloquently. They have a great, you know, window into the needs of their clients. And I think when they become aware of restorative justice as an option, they're really great champions for it. And then we also do take referrals from community members. And sometimes we're more able to do that than at others, but we're always really open to that conversation, because sometimes people will bring conflicts or disputes to us, or things that are happening in the community that they really think should have a restorative response. And those are always really interesting. And these are some of the types of referrals that we take. So in that green category, you'll have sort of lower level crimes, which could be assault, theft, you know, vandalism, that kind of thing. In that yellow category, these are cases we take. So we have taken cases involving you know, DUIs, felony cases, harassment, vehicular manslaughter. Those are all eligible on a case-by-case basis. And at this time, we do not take more aggravated violent offenses or sex offenses. And then the things that we're looking for if we take when we get a referral is, first of all, that the person who caused harm is willing to take accountability, and that, you know, they might have a perspective about what happened. Like we're not coming in with the narrative of we know exactly what happened. You know, like we might come in and hear things that we didn't know about the case. It doesn't mean so, but that in some way they're willing to take accountability. And that they're willing to, you know, participate in the process. And then we prefer, but we do not actually require that the person who is harmed participate in the process. Sometimes I think generally it can feel the most powerful when the person who is harmed does participate. One thing that I've seen in these situations is I'm always surprised. I'll have conversations ahead of time with the person who was harmed and have even been worried about how, things are going to be really tense in that room, or it's going to be a lot of high conflict in that room. And if anything, I've been surprised about how kind of understanding usually the victims are once you sit down face to face. But sometimes the victims do not want to participate, and sometimes there's good reason for that. And I think that we need to be realistic about that. And we have ways that we approach cases when victims don't want to participate. So we might have someone stand in for them as a surrogate. We might have other community members who've had similar experiences stand in and offer their perspective. And go on. Oh, and then these are just some numbers. They're a little bit dated, but I brought some up-to-date ones. So across back in 2020, 2021, we had 53 youth and 32 adults who were referred. And then 90% of the people harmed said that the restorative justice process met their needs. And then here in Lincoln County in the last year, we've had 10 adult referrals, with 6 of those, 4 of those have been closed and 2 are still in process, and 9 juvenile referrals that have worked with us, and or 9 juvenile cases. And then this is just an illustration of how we think about restorative processes. So the harm repair is really that second tier right there. That's what we're most known for. But it's just an important point that we see that all resting on the foundation of community building. And basically, like, if we don't have strong community relationships, then having strong community relationships and strong community ties are what make our communities the most safe. Yeah, you can go ahead. Oh, that's just a little, that's just a little animation. Yeah. Should I wind things up? Should I wind things up?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and yeah, so the other thing that we've been doing is we have a group of volunteers that Barbara is a part of that are a local steering team, a Lincoln County steering team, and they're working on a project that we're calling a community justice hub. And the idea there is that we want to get upstream of, before crimes have been committed, and think about the ways that restorative processes can prevent crime. So they're looking into things like mentoring, providing activities for youth, and things like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. And why don't we, I saw you had a slide about how to get involved. Why don't we do that toward the end? Right now, we'll do some questions. I'll start with a few just to get you started, but please feel free to ask your questions. I'd like to talk with both District Attorney Irving and Sheriff Bracket, that if mental health is part of what we're confronting with these people, how do we integrate the concept of mental health and those services with trying to do a restorative process?
That's a great question. And so Drew is probably would be very good at answering that. But part of the reparative process, right? So you have a harm repair circle, and part of that, like, the action point, right, is that the offender has basically a list of things that they need to do to repair the harm. And there, I would say if there's a mental health issue, and or a substance use disorder issue, that would be, a very common part of addressing the harm, right? That's how we get there. That's how people often get to the point of committing harm. Now, I told you that I'm on the Restorative Justice Steering Committee at the prison, and there's the IMHU there, the Intensive Mental Health Unit. And we have, considered trying to, there are folks that tend to, when they're severely psychotic, but they're still criminally responsible in Maine, because everybody's criminally responsible. Doesn't matter how mentally ill you are, you're always criminally responsible, basically. But there can be an assault. maybe a series of assaults. And we typically don't, at this point in my administration, I don't want to have year-long or more interrupting sentences for these folks, because, you know, by the time we get to court over it, they've been stabilized with medication and treatment and they're doing well, right? And now we're going to keep them in prison another 6 years. So we've discussed referrals for some of those folks, and that's kind of a real, that's a really intense area, right? And it has really become conclusive that there's going to be people that are just too severely ill to engage in the process. And I think that the best people to assess that are going to be facilitators to some extent, who are going to be checking in with mental health service providers. But otherwise, most of the folks that we're dealing with the types of things that Drew was talking about, right? The referrals, most of those folks maybe do have a trauma history, mental illness of some sort, co-occurring disorders, and substance use disorders potentially, right? But that's going to be part of repair, is them getting healthy.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add to that is I think for me, the perfect involvement for mental health folks in the restorative process is that they're not involved at all. They don't have to be involved. And when I say that, what I mean is this, right? Our mental health system is broken. It's severely broken. And with a lot of these cases, there should be mental health intervention before it ever gets to a crime. And that's not happening. And you know, I think the earlier intervention we can have with mental health crisis, and stabilize some of these situations, the more we can avoid perhaps the need for the restorative circle, the better we can have services, appropriate mental health services in place that follow folks if they do come into the system, so they can be involved in the circle, so they can be involved in the resolution that comes out of the circle, the follow through. As Natasha said, it's very common for us to get folks in the system with co-occurring disorder, mental health, substance use disorder, get them stabilized in a correctional setting because it's a controlled setting. We can help them with their medication. We can help stabilize. We can get them involved in counseling and different things. And then when they leave the facilities and go back into the community, oftentimes that's when they begin to spiral out of control. And there's not a lot of follow-up services available right now for mental. So for me, I'd like to see way more upfront services where we can avoid getting these folks into the justice system at all, whether it's at the restorative justice level or the court level. I don't understand. It's frustrating why we haven't been able to seem to be able to do that. We're better than we were, but there's still a lot of work, in my opinion, that needs to be done.
Thank you. Anyone out here have questions? I have more if you need them, but I'd rather you guys ask questions. Yes. I'm going to repeat the question after I hear it. Thank you. So the question is, and I probably won't say it as eloquently as you did, is there data that indicates this, how well people who have gone through the restorative justice process is, and how their outcome has been as compared to those who have not? Likelihood of reoffending, restorative justice versus typical criminal processes.
Yeah, let me just speak quickly to the part that's not working, right? So our jail isn't working. Nationally, about 67% of folks who come to jail will reoffend within a year or 6 months, depending, and our statistics here in Maine are very similar. Now, there are a lot of pieces that can affect that and have affected it successfully. I'm not really sure about the restorative justice statistics.
Yeah, so I'll say I don't have a great answer for you in terms of like data. I know that it's something that we've tried to track, but we've found it difficult to track. Like, we're a small nonprofit, and to do the kind of like longitudinal, tracking that would be necessary. But we have, so I don't know if we have great numbers right now. I will say that, we do, this is not really an answer to your question, but we do have people who are referred to us more than once at the Restorative Justice Project. And we don't see that as a bad thing, like meaning not that we want someone to reoffend or that we want someone to get in trouble again, but we don't see it as like we're working with them and then they should be cured and they should never have any problems again. And if they did, then it failed. We see it as sort of we're willing to be there as an ongoing presence in their lives, and everyone makes mistakes and everyone's going to make mistakes more than once.
When I took office 5 years ago, Sarah Maddox she works at Restorative Justice Project. She's like the person. She's like she's incredible. If you ever get a chance to do anything with Sarah Maddox, she's incredible. But at that time, I believe the stats, and I mean it is a small nonprofit, and and it's hard to really track the data years out. But they were having success in the over 90 percentile. It might have been around 95 percentile of not committing another offense that came through the justice system during a 3-year period, right? And when Sheriff Bracket says, the jail's not working and we're seeing people now, the other thing they're seeing, and that we do know the data is very, very clear, that typically, statistically, that the more people are coming back, the worse the crimes are getting. And that means somebody that starts out stealing cigarettes can end up committing an armed robbery, and somebody can end up dead. That things just get worse and worse and worse. And we often, the law enforcement sees just the tip of the iceberg often. How much family violence is going on before the police get called. How much, how many times has somebody, committed a violent offense or a theft without getting caught, or an OUI offense for that matter. So we do, just as Sheriff Bracket said, we're seeing it come back. It's not working. There are really, I wish I had prepared better for this, because there is. Is it still working? Yeah. Because there is really good national data about restorative justice processes.
Thank you. And I would just mention really briefly from my own experience that the other thing is, because of the juveniles being referred, we're getting them in an earlier stage and connecting them with services and mentors earlier. So I think also that is not necessarily easy to measure, but it has an inherent value. Questions?
What is the percentage of the population that are arrested fit into the categories? I think there's a couple of categories of eligible for restorative justice, and how many of those, sort of vaguely, what percentage of those actually go through the process? Trying to get a sense of how much of the problem can restorative justice look at and deal with, and how much does it?
In a general sense, and Drew's the expert here, but in a general sense, in order for restorative justice to be applicable, kind of in a criminal setting, right? There has to be a victim. Now, sometimes the victim is the community at large. So I would say OUIs, even though there isn't a named victim, we are all, at the mercy of these folks when we're driving home from school with our kids, right? So there has to be a victim, right? But as far as what would be eligible for restorative justice, out of what we're charging, there are a lot of offenses that get charged that are, there are an enormous amount that are driving without a license, right? Your license was suspended. There's a lot of these kind of administrative crimes that are not victim crimes that really are not eligible. And I would say, out of everything, there's a lot of stuff that's charged, that's resolved at the first, at arraignment, because people either get their licenses back or, so there's a large number that just wouldn't be ripe for restorative justice. But there's certainly, if there was, if this was part of the process and this was available for every victim crime, there are facilitators in the country that do domestic violence. There are victims. There have been victims in this district that are victims of sexual assault that want to use restorative justice, but we don't have and that's to no fault of Restorative Justice Project. We're a very small area, and that's a very, very, very specialized area of restorative justice. So really, the sky's the limit. And there's not only what happens at court, right? Because there's a lot, you can refer something that's been charged. You can also do a pre-charge referral. Like that could happen from our office before we charge something. It could also happen before it even comes to my office. In Knox County, there's a diversion program to send folks. Folks can get into treatment, can be diverted from the system without even having a charge. And they've done a pilot project in Waldo County, straight into restorative justice if both victim and offender, before charging and under certain circumstances, certain types of crimes could go.
Question again is restorative justice able to deal with a large percentage of the problem?
Well, I'll just say so we're the Restorative Justice Project, and as a nonprofit, we take these referrals. And as you saw, like on that slide there, like in, say 2020, 2021, we took 112 cases. I believe that's a drop in the bucket. So if we're talking about us, Restorative Justice Project, then the answer is no. Now, is there a world in which we shifted resources and it all worked differently? Maybe.
I think we need to get another. Do you want to talk, Sheriff, on that issue?
Well, all I could really do is speculate, but what I will say is this, right? And Natasha and I agree on a lot of things. We don't agree on everything. I'm a cop. She's a prosecutor, and we have different roles by design, by the way. That's good. That's part of why our system is healthy. But so, I think that despite there are some dangerous folks out here. And there are always going to be those cases, in my opinion, that don't qualify for that. Restorative justice just isn't going to be able to manage unless somehow separating that person from society for a period of time is in their wheelhouse somehow, right? And I'm not necessarily talking about incarceration. That might be inpatient treatment, that might be mental health treatment, that might be incarceration, or some combination thereof. So I don't look at restorative justice as and maybe I'm just being old and inflexible, and I don't mean to be, in the sense that because I'm anxious and it's working. I just think that there's always going to be, I don't know if that really answers your question, but I do think that there's always going to be a need, those cases that just aren't going to qualify for restorative justice.
And I have one more thing to say about it, which as Barbara said, that restorative justice, right, is something that we're talking about, that this originated in other communities, indigenous communities. In Somalia, restorative justice is the name of the game in many small communities around Somalia, and probably in other places, many other places. But Ubuntu, thank you, Chris Johnson. Yes, he's like, when I used to be a Democratic Party organizer with Max Rush, we used to just nerd out on Senator Johnson because he's just so smart. It's because of that. So you guys are very lucky. I'm so happy to be here tonight to hear that. So as you know, Valerie, right? So Lali at the prison in our restorative committee, he said that's, that he came to do the restorative justice steering committee because that's how he did things where he grew up, and he lived in a smaller village. And he said that's how justice was done, and that the community groups would meet, right? And sometimes it'd be one person from one village against another that committed a harm against somebody from another village. It could be one family and another family, but that could include up to capital punishment, basically, right? It was not done in the way that we do it in the United States, but it was the way justice was done. I am absolutely not in support of taking anyone's life for any reason. But it was really informative for me to think about, is because I always, think of this as the way that we do it in these processes from, referrals or what have you. But this is really a way of life for a lot of folks. And from there, I use restorative principles in parenting, and I've really embraced that. And now my daughter will say things like, "Can I just go to my room instead of, so it really is. And to that point, before I was district attorney, there was a manslaughter case, a vehicular manslaughter case that went through restorative justice. I believe it still resulted in jail or prison. Right. So there's really no cutoff. It's just and it can happen after somebody is convicted and is in prison or is in jail or is paid a fine. The process can happen. So there's really, the sky is the limit. But as far as like diversion from jail or prison, it's not going to be, in my opinion, it's, we still have places for people to keep victims safe and to keep communities safe when we need to. And I see that as being part of this, having that in some fashion for some time.
Thanks. I think we had a question back here in the room, and then we'll take our last 5 minutes to talk about how you can become involved. Yes, sir. So the question was, how does restorative justice deal with outside influences of the offender, such as family and friends?
Well, involving the community and the family is a really big part of it. And I don't know if maybe I'm reading into what you said. It sounded like you were saying like negative influences. Okay. Well, so in a restorative justice project, I mean, especially with juveniles, right? Their parent is always going to be there. But even with adults, we're always asking them, who supports you? Who do you rely on? Who do you want to have with you? And that's just it's just like an integral part of how we work. And so at every meeting that we would have with them, we would encourage them to have their supports there. At the conference or at the circle, we encourage them to have supportive people in their lives there, or even we'll reconnect them with people in their lives. That teacher, from a couple years ago, or you like this guidance counselor at school. Can we call them up? Can we see if they want to come? So I guess maybe my answer to your question is that we really look for the supportive links in their lives and try to like build those up and bring them into the process as much as possible. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and then we'll do our, of course we make referrals, especially when people need resources like mental health resources and other resources, I mean, to the best of our ability.
I was just to make,
I'm sorry.
I'm going to say something really quick and then please,
yeah,
but I was just saying from a practical standpoint, as a person who runs these, we actually have a list with all these different questions we can ask, and those include, who are you relying on most in your life? How are your friends? Is anyone treating you badly? We can pick from all of them. So there really is a dynamic process that we use. And please now.
And I can't help but I have to get on my soapbox. So, we talk about mental health infrastructure, like there isn't any. If there isn't any for adults, like it is unimaginable how poor we treat children with mental health issues in this state. It should be a crime. We need our legislators, we need our governor to fund mental health for children and fund it for adults. But children have nothing. There's Riverview for adults, there's none for children. But my other soapbox that I have to get on is safe, stable, affordable housing. It took me a year to find a rental to move to in Rockland because I needed to move from my house. I wasn't ready to buy a house in Rockland. I needed to move. It took me a year. I'm the district attorney. I am an attorney. I am the district attorney. It was that difficult. Folks who are living on the edge, this is why it's such a big problem. It's because it's not necessarily that they're living on a park bench or in a homeless encampment. It's that they're staying on people's couches they're still using. They're staying in crack houses or drug homes, right? And these other people need help too. Everybody needs help. They're staying with a family member who's beating the hell out of them, right? A loved one who's hurting them. It goes on and on and on because there isn't a safe, affordable place for people to go. And I cannot, and Sheriff Bracket, when the COVID money came in, we were begging Lincoln County to help with some infrastructure for housing. But I mean, the amount that we need, if the district attorney needed to be able to find housing and it took that long, what do people that don't have, an income like I have and don't have the resources and don't have the references and don't have credit, what do people do? And we see it. So if we can't get people into safe, stable, affordable housing, dignified living conditions, then that's the big problem because they could have supports and they do often have some supports, right? But it's when they can't go somewhere that's safe at night, or they can't stay somewhere for a long period of time that can be a safe home, that we see people spiraling back. Did you have anything you wanted to say?
Just, it's a really good question. And you know, it concerns me how many families that we deal with that don't have those traditional supports, where that's not an easy question to answer. You heard Natasha refer to the trauma that a lot of these folks have been through. That's very real, and you know, it's a real challenge for us in some circumstances to find that support network and keep it in place, unless you engage some sort of outside service. And you know, so we talk about on the restorative end, you know, once somebody's into our system, how do we react? And this is an important conversation. But an equally important conversation is how do we fix, how do we mend or repair or build or improve on those early relationships, that whether it's, I don't know what the right word is, traditional parenting, proper parenting, I don't know what the right word is, you know, the family dynamic, early childhood education in general. These are all things that statistically a lot of information on that helps prevent folks. If we can get to the root cause, we can keep them out of the system in the longer term. So it's really got to be a combination of things. We're focused on restorative justice tonight, which is the after the crisis has happened, right? But there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the other end.
So
Oh, can I just add one thing? When we have kids or kids or adults going through restorative justice, Barbara mentioned this before, but we match them with a mentor who meets with them once a week. So that is just an additional support that we provide. And one thing that I've seen happen, kind of to your point, Todd, not really by design, but sometimes the mentor ends up being in touch with the parent more than the kid, and can be, you know, some of our volunteers are, you know, parents who've raised teenagers, and I've seen some sort of good, you know, support happen that way, just being in communication with a parent of a child who's going through restorative justice.
I think we could go on a long time, but I know we're supposed to have a business meeting and I'm probably supposed to stop things. But I really would like to have the last 5 minutes deal with how you can help. Now, of course, we've sort of gone from restorative justice to mental health issues, but they do all get hooked in together. But I know that Drew has some specific information on how you can help. And I don't know if you two would like to speak more generally first about it and then let Drew go to her slide and find out about how you can help.
Okay, well, I actually don't have. Oh, I don't think we need it. Or well, yeah, I mean, I can talk for I'll talk about 2 minutes about our volunteer programs, but the main thing is that we offer training for volunteers in the fall and in the winter usually. So we're not training people right now, but our training it's something to think about, you know, like for, you know, late August, early September, if this sounds interesting to you. And it's free for people who are going to volunteer with us. And there are a few different roles that we have for volunteers. We have mentors. I just described what that is. We have facilitators. So those are the people who are actually facilitating these restorative conferences, bringing people who are in conflict to a common resolution. We have a program called Open Table that I don't think we're seeking volunteers for it right now, but it's a reentry program. So we work with right now I think have 2 or 3 people we're working with who are coming out of incarceration, and it's like a support program for them as they restart their lives. And in addition to that, we have our community justice hub steering teams, and those are people who are doing some real thinking about how can we get upstream of crime and kind of provide some of these community supports that we're talking about that would make our communities safer and keep crime from happening. So if you're interested in talking to me more, you can just send me an email, drew@rjpmidcoast.org, or talk to me afterwards. And I think on our website right now, there's a page if you go to volunteering, and you can like sign up to be notified of when our training opens again.
I'll be as brief as a lawyer it can be. So, the other, there's, I'm going to recommend a book to everyone that's really profound, just a great read. It's called Before We Reckon. Maybe we can put this up somewhere. It's called Before We Reckon by Danielle Sered, Sered. It is a really great book, but it's a really helpful, and it's something that I've reread a couple of times. I reread passages from it to kind of keep myself inspired sometimes. So I think that that's a great book to read. The other ways you can kind of get involved in, because Drew showed you that pyramid, right, and the building the communities, right? So find out from your local school, if you're involved with your local schools or in a business that you work with or a volunteer organization that you're with, how do you address harm? In your family, how do you address harm and become more educated? Look, like we've got resources at the library. You can look, as my dad would have said, type it into Google. But you can learn how to really incorporate these processes in your life. And I can't say enough about, we were talking about the way that you start a circle is you say, how are you coming to this circle today? And I was saying, I'm so used to doing this now that at first I thought it was hokey. But it's like sometimes the only time I ever actually think about how do I actually feel, because there's so much going on. And if you can instill that in yourself and in the people that you're with, and then you can really figure out why you're doing the things you're doing sometimes. And that change as an individual, and the more you learn, talk to your friends about it, talk to your neighbors about it. And that might sound ridiculous, but that's how real community change is going to happen. Is we can do stuff like that because we are little still, we are these little rural communities, and that's where it can happen.
So you can also talk to me if you're interested in volunteering. We're very interested in getting mentors who help work with the kids and find out what can be helpful to them as well as adults. And also we are looking at this Lincoln County Community Hub, where we are trying to create opportunities to work with young people before things become problematic and give them community connections and activities here, which are difficult because of rural Maine. So I want to thank this absolutely wonderful panel, DA Natasha Irving, Sheriff Todd Bracket, and Drew Himmelstein of RJP. Thank you very much.